What it means is the ability, the power, the realization to leave the human body superconsciously through the top of the head, the seat of the soul, the Sahasrara chakra, because that is our destiny. Good morning and welcome to everyone. We have several topics today, so this might take an hour. No, our theme today, where'd you go? Oh, there they are. Our theme today is to honor the earthly passing of these two great saints, both of whom are in our lineage of gurus. Paramhansa Yogananda, whose teachings we follow here in his departure from Earth on March 7th, 1952, at the Biltmore Hotel in Los Angeles. Many of us, even here in this room, have been to the Biltmore Hotel, not because we're high flyers, but because we went there to meditate. What is now their lobby was the banquet room at that time, in the early 50s, for that hotel. And the staff there is accustomed to the fact that particularly on March 7th or thereabouts, these strange-looking people come in and sit in the lobby and close their eyes and meditate. Some years ago, we met one of the staff there who had been present, or at least was on staff at that particular time, and the very event touched him quite greatly. And then his guru, Swami Sri Yukteswar, 16 years earlier on March 9th, 1936, in Puri, India, at his own ashram, left his body. Why do we celebrate that? I mean, lots of people die. In fact, I'm told everyone dies. But it's because we don't. That's why. One of the earliest aspects, that is to say, earliest in chapter 1, I think it is, of the Bhagavad Gita, Lord Krishna assures his disciple Arjuna that no one really dies. Our souls are eternal. We know that's the teaching of the ages. That's not a new teaching, of course, but it's a very difficult thing to realize, after all. Most people do, in fact, fear death, although there are some who welcome it as well, such as the duality of this life. And so what is it then that we celebrate? We celebrate for the simple fact that their lives were as a life of not just affirmation, but realization of that immortal soul within themselves, and their actions, not just teachings, aren't that important. I enjoy this reading once a year. What use does one have for a scripture at a time of flood? I mean, well, you know, whatever she read. And I chuckled because I think here we are in Washington, where it's practically always flooding most of the year. So what use do we have for scripture? Well, anyway, that's my strange sense of humor. But their lives reflected the realization of that immortality. One can't prove, quote, a so-called miracle, but nonetheless, there are signs in the history of the great saints down through the ages of the unusual circumstances that surround their passing from this life. Sometimes they know in advance, although lots of people do actually. Other times they predict the time and circumstances. Other situations, they are seen resurrected after their passing by close disciples, and so on. But again, that's not really the important part. I think in India, at least my impression is that any saintly person who dies is said to go into Mahasamadhi. That's people tend to either exaggerate or not understand these kinds of things. But we celebrate what it means in terms of the passing is the ability, the power, the realization to leave the human body consciously, not just consciously, but superconsciously, not to have a break in the awareness that most human beings, when they die, they lose consciousness, at least for during some aspect of the death passage, but to remain fully conscious, to exit the body fully conscious. Not through the subconscious mind, the yogis say, which is here at the base of the brain, but for a realized yogi through the top of the head, the seat of the soul, the Sahasrara chakra. This is what we celebrate for them, but truthfully, that's their business. Why do we celebrate it? Because that is our destiny. Our destiny is to realize our innate immortality. So, in addition to that, however, we do have the reading, and one could imagine that the reading is warning us from false prophets, which in fact it is. But I don't know that that's the greatest concern you and I have here today in a place such as this. I think the false prophets are of our own making. Idolatry is the making of false images. I can think of many stories, but one just pops into my head of somebody who was with Yogananda, and Swami Kriyananda, who founded Ananda, who lived with Yogananda for as long a period of time as Jesus' disciples lived with him, said that during those last years of Yogananda's life, his ashram there in Los Angeles was like a hotel, people checking in and checking out. He said, he gave the story rather of this one disciple who was there and very devoted seemingly, and then one day she heard about some other teacher who was kind of a miracle worker, and she left. So later she came back, she did not have that light, that vibrancy in her eyes that others witnessed when she was with the Master. So the idols that we create, the false imagining, sometimes it's of our great spiritual stature, and when people talk too much of their inner experiences, that's a good warning sign. That's a false teacher. The ego has a habit of taking credit for the messages from the soul. So we are cautioned as meditators not to talk so blithely and openly and proudly, in effect, of our intuitions, of our inner experiences, unless it be with someone who can perhaps guide us and so forth. I receive a great deal of correspondence in the work I do from all over the world, although I must admit our friends in India are far greater correspondents than these Americans who just aren't on the page, I guess. But anyway, I get a lot of questions about inner experiences. And it's also true that in a country like India, and there are other countries that have other sort of psychic vibrations. America doesn't really, particularly. But in any case, I get a lot of correspondence about inner experiences. And the theme that always comes to me about such things is they generally have no meaning at all. They're just way showers. In Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, he says such things you can meditate on, help concentrate your mind, open your heart, and to see all things, as we should all the time, outward or inward, as the Divine Mother simply speaking to us and sharing with us according to our karma, according to our needs. That's why in this affirmation of forgiveness, I don't know how many of us can actually live through those words, accepting all things that come to us, and of course, particularly the hurts that come to us as gifts from Divine Mother. And so these inner perceptions are simply there to help us stay internalized, to deepen our concentration, and so on. The message of this reading today, and the message of the lives of great saints everywhere, is the equivalency between faith and intuition. In this language of ours, English, and in this culture of ours, here in America, I would say the average person, if you did a survey out on the so-called street, if you asked them somehow, worded it in the correct way, to ask them is there an equivalency between those two words, I doubt very many people would see any connection between faith and intuition. I've always enjoyed, that is to say, found spiritual upliftment and inspiration from the famous quote of St. Paul, faith is the substance faith is the substance of things hoped for, evidence of things unseen. There's a lot one can meditate on to try to understand that. But before we go there, intuition is our sixth sense. We have 5 physical senses, and we have an astral sixth sense. And that sixth sense, Yogananda defined it as he didn't often define things, but he did define intuition as the soul's power to know God. In some ways, that's not a very useful definition from day to day, but if you go into it a little deeper, it's the power of the soul to know, period. God is everything. God is infinite. God is all truth, etc., etc. So the power to know God is the power to know, simply. Gnosis, okay? Gnostics. And so that power to know is, to the extent you know, to the extent you have confidence. And faith, to live a life of faith, is the spiritual path. In a way, you could say it's that simple. So you can develop your intuition by living by faith, and if you develop your intuition, you will live by faith. It's an equivalency. And so it is that the most effective means to develop that muscle, that window onto what is true, is silence, stillness, born of meditation, born of receptivity. It's born of the one thing very few people are very good at, listening. Now, I'm reminded of a couple of stories. I don't know why it has to, these 2 stories that came into my head are about farmers, but that's probably a different subject that we're not going to talk about today. One time, and I don't know, Yogananda didn't say where he met these 2 characters, but one time he was in a farmhouse with this guy. Why Yogananda would be in a farmhouse, sitting around shooting the breeze, I have no idea. It wasn't what he usually did, but he tells the story that he was in this farmhouse, and I'm guessing this farmer must have went to one of his lectures or something and invited him to visit his farm. So he's sitting there, and this farmer was proudly boasting of his intuitive abilities. And Yogananda could sort of intuitively felt that he wasn't intuitive. And so there came a knock on the door. And so Yogananda turned to the farmer and said, well, what does your intuition tell you? He said, I think that's my cousin who I haven't seen in years. He was right, sure enough. They opened the door, and it was his cousin he hadn't seen in a few years. So, okay. From the story that he tells, I gather it was some days or at some other occasion that Yogananda was then also at in the parlor of the farmer's home. And this time a knock came on the door, and the farmer said, I think it's my uncle. And Yogananda said, it sure is your uncle, but I'm getting out of here. You open the door. So the farmer gets up, opened the door, and it was this bull. It was pouring rain out there. That's why I think it was in Seattle. And this bull came charging in to try to get out of the rain. So yeah, that was your uncle, all right. He called it semi-intuition. You know, if you do think of it, and our culture doesn't think of it, our culture doesn't think much about intuition, doesn't talk much about intuition. I've mentioned this a few years ago that I read an article by what was then the president of Harvard University, who had a very excellent article about education, but at the end of the article, she said, we don't believe in intuition, just facts, and so forth. I felt sort of sad by that, because when you think of someone like Einstein, the great people, composers in the arts, in the sciences, in religion, etc., it's always about that receptivity, that leap. You go A, B, C, D, and whatever it is you're doing, and then there's this leap, and it's a leap of faith. The awe. I mean, you think about it. I'm sure we all have thought about it. if you just stop what you're doing. I love to go out into places unlike Seattle where we don't have stars here. It was the one thing I really missed when I moved here from Ananda Village 30-some years ago. I looked up and I never saw a star since. I was just there 2 weeks ago at the Expanding Light Retreat and just walked out at night and just gloried in all these stars they have down there. But anytime we have done that, or at the ocean, or on, in the mountains, when you see the vastness of the universe, when you cognize and intuit that vastness, yes, you can sometimes feel small, but you're the center of that experience, so you can't be that small. You're the only one there, as it were. But as Yogananda once put it in a talk, a recorded talk, I think I can hear his voice saying, "What right do you think you have to do or want anything? You don't know where you came from. You don't know where you're going to go after you shed this body. Our only real right is to do the will of Him who created us." Now, we have things to work out, and we should always use our initiative if we have, I think of children who, stories, and they knew they were born to do this. Yes, of course. But still, the ego takes hold of whatever is within its grip through the five senses and claims it as our own. Yogananda used the example. I've had a few houses in my checkered career, and there's other people living in those houses. There were some people living in those houses before I had them. We're just not here that long. And so if we can listen and tune into what is trying to happen, that's kind of a mantra at Ananda that's been developed over the last 50 years, to ask ourselves when faced with a decision, what's trying to happen? Not what is my opinion, not what do I want or don't want, but what's trying to happen. Or thy will, not my will, if you want to personalize it. Either one will work, because either way, it's tuning in. The other farmer I was thinking of was the story of this was in Seattle, well, in Washington State anyway. Actually, I can think of two more stories. Down in Longview, is that a place in Washington? Longview, okay. Down that part of the state, that's where they're famous for growing cranberries, right? And this was back in the 30s, I suppose. And I suppose fertilizers were just sort of being invented back then or something. Anyway, so Yogananda meets this cranberry farmer. I don't know what he was doing down. He once went to some little, I can't think of the name, but right outside of Spokane is this cheesy little town. It's still there. Why he went to that town, I'll never know. Probably there was a soul, like Jesus going to Samaria, to the woman in the well, that he needed to touch. But in any case, somewhere in, like where from Saguna's from, where you're from Longview, that's it, yeah, where they grow those cranberries. He meets this farmer, and the guy says he's just losing money hand over fist. You'll laugh at this, but Yogananda says, why don't you try some fertilizers? So the guy tried some fertilizers, and he made a huge amount of money. I mean, by today's standard, a couple of $100,000. I don't know what fertilizers he used, and I sort of think, gee, that's a crazy thing for Yogananda to have said, given what you and I know, but there it is. But the other one I was going to mention was the one where he was also at a farm somewhere around here, and he said he got hungry, and he saw that there was a farm nearby growing cherries. We grow cherries in this state somewhere, east side maybe, I don't know. And so he goes to get these cherries, and they were yummy cherries, and he's talking to this fellow. And Yogananda, as well as our teacher Swami Kriyananda, had a gift. And that gift was to be natural, to be who you are. I'm just as a side note, tangent, okay? And so Yogananda, and as I witnessed with our teacher Padmanaya, because we were with him under many different occasions rather than just so-called spiritual occasions, and the ability to talk with anyone, to find something to relate to with anyone, is a gift of maturity. Yes, of course, it means relating to other people's realities, but that naturalness of demeanor is something we should all. And what blocks that besides fear and other things? A lot of it is the dogmatism. You know, somebody, maybe they don't meditate, or maybe they are in a religion you don't care for, or maybe their politics is in a different direction than yours. You know what I'm trying to say? Okay. So being able to relate to anyone is itself a kind of forgiveness. So he meets this farmer, and they're sitting around swapping stories, as I imagine. And Yogananda has this intuition about this fellow. And so at some point in the conversation, he says to him, "You have a son, don't you?" And he said, "Yes, I have a son." And he's a big disappointment, isn't he? Yes, he's a big disappointment. And then the farmer says, he explained a little bit about his son's wayward ways. He went out drinking all the time and so on and so forth. And the farmer said, "He's going to go to hell. He's going to burn in hell." And so they had this nice meeting and conversation, but then when the conversation went a different way, this farmer, some of his other issues came up. So Yogananda said, "I have a cure for this guy." The farmer said, "Really?" "Yeah. You have a long rope somewhere?" he said. "Yeah." "And you have that big oven out there for whatever farmers do with ovens?" "Yeah." "Well, I'll tell you what, why don't we stay up late tonight, and when your son comes in drunk, we'll tie him up and we'll throw him in the burning oven." And the farmer said, "What?" And then right away, the farmer had a little bit of intuition. He realized, if you couldn't do that to your own son, why would God do that to you and I? And so, getting back to intuition, not so much with false teachers, of which there are plenty. That's not really the issue so much, because we don't realize. I hear students and people, in our line of work, if you'll pardon that expression, comparing gurus, spiritual teachers, right? And this one and that one and so on. I have opinions about some of them too, but it really isn't that important. One of the great gifts that Swami Kriyananda gave to us, because by all rights of tradition and role, he would be and was by some considered the guru. He refused to have us, who were close to him, his own family, as if you will. He refused to play that role with people. He said, I will feel successful spiritually in this life to the degree I have been a good disciple. The issue isn't whether this guru or that guru is the best thing going. It's, am I a good disciple? Whether it be of life or God in any form, or I don't mean just in terms of a guru-disciple relationship. We don't realize how rare sanctity is. As a boy, I remember as a Catholic boy, and you pray to the saints, and I loved all of that, but I looked around and I didn't see any. I remember praying to Jesus and said, 2,000 years ago? I mean, what am I doing here? Where are you, in other words? Well, as Jesus himself said repeatedly, in effect, I am here for those with eyes to see and ears to hear. And I know in my life that there are saints. I've seen them. I know them. But until you can open yourself up to listen and see, you'll never see them. Lots of people went through that revolving door at Mount Washington, as I mentioned earlier. Yogananda wasn't good enough for them. I'm sure the same was true of Jesus. Besides, they crucified him. So it's all about knowing. And that knowing is not intellectual. You can learn all the chakras. You can learn, what Sabikalpa Samadhi is and how it differs from Nirvikalpa Samadhi. Or you can ask me. That was a joke. We just did the Yoga Sutras, didn't we, Kevin? And, you read these scriptures and you think, oh my God, what are we doing here pretending to even know what they're talking about? But I consider the sutras as a time capsule buried for Treta Yuga or some future age when we do have eyes to see and ears to hear and hearts that are open. But that is the question. Whether it's the revelations of science or in our world today with false news or whatever it's called, the older you get, the more you realize you don't know nothing. Whereas when I was in my 20s, I knew it all, okay? So the extent by which we know nothing is vast. So why do we think our opinions are that important? Why can't we just be quiet for a change? To be still, to accept, to forgive, to let people be who they are. Doesn't mean you have to interact with people who don't like you, and there's always, there's only two kinds of people, right? Sita, those who like you and those who don't. It's that simple. Well, I guess there's a third kind, those who don't care, but maybe that's a little bit of both, I don't know. So the important thing then is to be still and know. And that's why we're here today. That's why meditation has, as it were like a lotus, has blossomed onto the planet to receive all those who would know, who would be still and know. There is so much shouting happening in this planet of ours. And what we need is to listen, not just to one another. I mean, that's a good start, of course. That's what we're hearing. But when we get quiet, we can hear another voice. And living by faith is to use the common sense mentioned in the reading, to use your common sense to take one step in front of the other. Because in what we do here, Padma and I particularly over many decades, helping people to be trained in the teachings here of Yoganandaji and to be initiated into Kriya and so forth. So we've met, countless numbers of people who basically are invited into the opportunity to take discipleship to this lineage. Well, think of a marriage or friendship. Can you define it? No. You can't define discipleship either. In fact, even less so. It's very individual. It's very unique. But take one step, place one foot in front of the other. What's come to you in life by your own efforts, your own energy, your own inspiration, your own thoughts, whatever, what comes to you, see if it's yours. Use your common sense. And so I won't go into all the aspects of that here today, but we often find with people that just take the next step. Very often your dharma is right in front of you. Sometimes there are big leaps of faith that people do, but to lead a life of faith is to take one step after the other, to follow the breadcrumbs, as Padma put it the other day. Breadcrumbs, yeah. It makes me think I'm a bird or something, but anyway, I don't particularly want to follow breadcrumbs, but anyway. Just.
A lost child. Hansel and Gretel.
I'm sure she'll explain that later. But truthfully, for most people, it's right in front of us. The person in front of us, where we are here today. We just have to tune in. And I admit that's very difficult for most of us to do. Without a daily practice of meditation, without the daily habit of listening, taking breaks between your activities, looking up, living more and more at the spiritual eye and in the heart, they're connected. It's the life of faith. The life of faith accepts life as it comes, does what you can to improve it, but otherwise you just keep moving. You keep taking one step after the other. I remember, I'll finish up here. I remember when I was young that I didn't, trained in this culture with the left brain sort of being enlarged, as it were. I never imagined I could ever be intuitive. And now, many, many years later, I can't imagine a life without the flow of gnosis, the flow of understanding, the flow of perception. Now remember, maybe I should add this before I finish up, the foundation of intuition is humility. It's that humility before the great life that surrounds us. Because when you take for granted your knowing, your intuition, that's the pride before the fall. And so, but nonetheless, I can't imagine a life without the calm confidence, the substance of things hoped for. What's hoped for? What's hoped for is the grace to know. What's hoped for is the feeling of the divine presence in your words, in your actions, in your life, and in every cell of your body. And the evidence of things unseen is the fruit of the life of faith. The life of faith proves itself in the synchronicity, in the harmony that surrounds your life. It doesn't mean there aren't conflicts on an outer level, but within yourself you remain calm, confident, and accepting.
Thy will